Hi, this is Andrea Mackenzie back again with you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today I'll be reading chapter 13 of the first year from Ella Montgomery's Anne of Windy Poplars / Anne of Windy Willows. Again, I am reading from a Second World War copy of Anne of Windy Willows. Chapter 13, the first year, Anne of Windy Willows. When you've been old and bedrid as long as me, you'll have more sympathy, whined Mrs. Gibson. Please don't think I'm lacking in sympathy, Mrs. Gibson, said Anne, who after half an hour's vain effort felt like wringing Mrs. Gibson's neck. Nothing but poor Pauline's pleading eyes in the background kept her from giving up in despair and going home. I assure you, you won't be lonely and neglected. I will be here all day and see that you lack nothing in any way. Oh, I know I'm of no use to anyone, said Mrs. Gibson, apropos of nothing that had been said. You don't need to rub that in, Miss Shirley. I'm ready to go any time. Any time. Pauline can gad round all she wants to then. I won't be here to feel neglected. None of the young people of today have any sense. Giddy, very giddy. Anne didn't know whether it was Pauline or herself who was the giddy young person without sense, but she tried the last shot in her locker. Well, you know, Mrs. Gibson, people will talk so terribly if Pauline doesn't go to her cousin's silver wedding. Talk, said Mrs. Gibson sharply. What will they talk about? Dear Mrs. Gibson, may I be forgiven the adjective, thought Anne. In your long life you have learned, I know, just what idle tongues can say. You needn't be casting my age up to me, snapped Mrs. Gibson. And I don't need to be told it's a censorious world. Too well, I know it. And I don't need to be told that this town is full of tattling toads neither. But I don't know, so I fancy them jabbering about me, saying, I suppose, that I'm an old tyrant. I ain't stopping Pauline from going. Didn't I leave it to her conscience? So few people will believe that, said Anne, carefully sorrowful. Mrs. Gibson sucked a peppermint lozenge fiercely for a minute or two. Then she said, I hear there's mumps at White Sands. Ma, dear, you know I've had the mumps. There's folks as takes them twice. You'd be just the one to take them twice. Pauline, you always took everything that come round. The nights I've sat up with you not expecting you'd see the morning. Ah, me, a mother's sacrifices ain't long remembered. Besides, how would you get to White Sands? You ain't been on a train for years. And there ain't any train back Saturday night. She could go on the Saturday morning train, said Anne, and I'm sure Mr. James Gregor will bring her back. I never liked Jim Gregor. His mother was a tarbush. He is taking his double-seated buggy and going down Friday, or else he would take her down, too. But she'll be quite safe on the train, Mrs. Gibson. Just step on at Summerside, step off at White Sands. No changing. There's something behind all this, said Mrs. Gibson suspiciously. Why are you so set on her going, Miss Shirley? Just tell me that. Anne smiled into the beady-eyed face. Because I think Pauline is a good, kind daughter to you, Mrs. Gibson, and needs a day off now and then, just as everybody does. Most people found it hard to resist Anne's smile. Either that or the fear of gossip vanquished Mrs. Gibson. I suppose it never occurs to anyone I'd like a day off from this wheelchair if I could get it, but I can't. I just have to bear my affliction patiently. Well, if she must go, she must. She's always been one to get her own way. If she catches mumps or gets poisoned by strange mosquitoes, don't blame me for it. I'll have to get along as best I can. Oh, I suppose you'll be here, but you ain't used to my ways as Pauline is. I suppose I can stand it for one day. If I can't, well, I've been living on borrowed time many's the year now, so what's the difference? Not a gracious assent by any means, but still an assent. Anne, in her relief and gratitude, found herself doing something she would never have imagined herself doing. She bent over and kissed Mrs. Gibson's leathery cheek. "Thank you," she said. "Never mind your wheedling ways," said Mrs. Gibson. "Have a peppermint." "How can I ever thank you, Miss Shirley?" said Pauline, as she went a little way down the street with Anne. "By going to White Sands with a light heart and enjoying every minute of the time." "Oh, I'll do that. You don't know what this means to me, Miss Shirley. It's not only Louisa I want to see. The old Luckley place next to her home is going to be sold, and I did so want to see it once more before it passed into the hands of strangers. Mary Luckley, she's Mrs. Howard Fleming now and lives out west, was my dearest friend when I was a girl. We were like sisters. I used to be at the Luckley place so much, and I loved it so. I've often dreamed of going back. Ma says I'm getting too old to dream. Do you think I am, Miss Shirley? Nobody is ever too old to dream, and dreams never grow old." "I'm so glad to hear you say that. Oh, Miss Shirley, to think of seeing the Gulf again. I haven't seen it for 15 years. The harbor is beautiful, but it isn't the Gulf. I feel as if I'm walking on air, and I owe it all to you. It was just because Ma likes you she let me go. You've made me happy. You are always making people happy. Why, whenever you come into a room, Miss Shirley, the people in it feel happier." "That's the very nicest compliment I've ever had paid me, Pauline." "There's just one thing, Miss Shirley. I've nothing to wear but my old black taffeta. It's too gloomy for a wedding, isn't it? And it's too big for me since I got thin. You see, it's 6 years since I got it." "We must try to induce your mother to let you have a new dress," said Anne, hopefully. But that proved to be beyond her powers. Mrs. Gibson was adamant. Pauline's black taffeta was quite good enough for Louisa Hilton's silver wedding. "I paid $2 a yard for it 6 years ago and 3 to Jane Sharp for making it. Jane was a good dressmaker. Her mother was a Smiley. The idea of you wanting something light, Pauline Gibson. She'd go dressed in scarlet from head to foot, that one, if she was let, Miss Shirley. She's just waiting till I'm dead to do it. Ah, well, you'll soon be quit of all the trouble I am to you, Pauline. Then you can dress as gay and giddy as you like. But as long as I'm alive, you'll be decent. And what's the matter with your hat? It's time you wore a bonnet anyhow." Poor Pauline had a lively horror of having to wear a bonnet. She would wear her old hat for the rest of her life before she would do that. "I'm just going to be glad inside and forget all about my clothes," she told Anne, when they went out to the garden to pick a bouquet of June lilies and bleeding heart for the widows. "I've a plan," said Anne, with a cautious glance to make sure that Mrs. Gibson couldn't hear, though she was watching from the sitting room window. "You know that silver gray poplin of mine? I'm going to lend you that for the wedding." Pauline dropped the basket of flowers in her agitation, making a pool of pink and white sweetness at Anne's feet. "Oh, my dear, I couldn't. Ma wouldn't let me. She won't know a thing about it. Listen, Saturday morning, you'll put it on under your black taffeta. I know it will fit you. It's a little long, but I'll run some tucks in it tomorrow. Tucks are fashionable now. It's collarless with elbow sleeves, so no one will suspect. As soon as you get to Gull Cove, take off the taffeta. When the day is over, you can leave the poplin at Gull Cove, and I can get it the next weekend I'm home. But wouldn't it be too young for me? Not a bit of it. Any age can wear gray. Do you think it would be right to deceive Ma? Faltered Pauline. In this case, entirely right, said Anne shamelessly. You know, Pauline, it would never do to wear a black dress to a wedding. It might bring the bride bad luck. Oh, I wouldn't do that for anything. And of course, it won't hurt Ma. I do hope she'll get through Saturday all right. I'm afraid she won't eat a bite when I'm away. She didn't the time I went to Cousin Matilda's funeral. Miss Prouty told me she didn't. Miss Prouty stayed with her. She was so provoked at Cousin Matilda for dying. Ma was, I mean. She'll eat. I'll see to that. I know you've a great knack of managing her, conceded Pauline. And you won't forget to give her her medicine at the regular times, will you, dear? Oh, perhaps I oughtn't to go after all. You've been out there long enough to pick 40 bouquets, called Mrs. Gibson irately. I don't know what the widows want of your flowers. They've plenty of their own. I'd go a long time without flowers if I waited for Rebecca Dew to send me any. I'm dying for a drink of water, but then I'm of no consequence. On Friday night, Pauline telephoned Anne in terrible agitation. She had a sore throat, and did Miss Shirley think it could possibly be the mumps? Anne ran down to reassure her, taking the gray poplin in a brown paper parcel. She hid it in the lilac bush, and late that night, Pauline, in a cold perspiration, managed to smuggle it upstairs to the little room where she kept her clothes and dressed, though she was never permitted to sleep there. Pauline was not quite easy about the dress. Perhaps her sore throat was a judgment on her for deception. But she couldn't go to Louise's silver wedding in that dreadful old black taffeta. She simply couldn't. And that ends chapter 13 of the first year of Anne of Windy Poplars, Anne of Windy Willows. Thanks very much for listening. This is Andrea Mackenzie saying bye for now and signing off.